What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. As always, thank you for joining me. My name is Paul Brettel. Today, we're going to discuss the NFL Combine, specifically some Packers draft prospects that you should have your eyes on moving forward based on how they performed this past week at the NFL Combine. But before we do all that, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work, including the article version, what we're talking about here today over at ESPNLacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports fans, Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, radio, whatever you need, download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. So like I said, the NFL Combine just took place this past week. Measurements, on-field testing, all that good stuff. All elements that go into the evaluation, the pre-draft process for the Green Bay Packers. And during Brian Gutekunst's tenure, at some positions more than others, but generally speaking, there are specific measurables, athletic traits, times and specific drills that tend to have stood out at specific position groups. So we're going to go through a handful of those positions in need that the Packers have and which prospects met those, again, typical athletic measurement thresholds that the Green Bay Packers have. Now, before we dive into all that, the disclaimer, right? This is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to the evaluation process. This is one tool in the tool belt. And we're going to talk about today, depending on the position group, some specific NFL Combine drills that seem to be of significance to the Green Bay Packers and also relative athletic scores. I have a whole video devoted to what relative athletic scores are, how they pertain to the Green Bay Packers. In short, it's a 0 to 10 scale. The higher the score, the better the athlete relative to his respective position group. And throughout Brian Gutekunst's tenure as general manager of the Packers, there has been a strong connection between Packers draft picks and their score, high scores, on the relative athletic score scale. So we're going to use that benchmark as well as part of our conversation today. But again, this is not the be-all, end-all by any means. I don't think that Brian Gutekunst is looking up relative athletic scores, at Lambeau Field, determining who's going to be on his draft board. But the reason why I want to highlight who these prospects are, how they performed in these areas, is because from our outside perspective, when there is overlap, when there does seem to be some sort of potential connection to some information that we have and how the Packers might view prospects, we want to take a deeper dive into any sort of aspect that we can get to perhaps get a little bit of a inside track, right? It's a peek behind the curtain, any sort of understanding that we can find to who might be on the Green Bay Packers radar. So again, I think this is helpful information. I find it valuable, but again, not the be all end all. Doesn't mean that these prospects are going to end up as Packers. Doesn't mean that players who maybe didn't hit these thresholds are not on their radar. Absolutely could be. But generally speaking, Brian Gutekunst's draft history, these are noticeable RAS scores. These are noticeable measurements, times, and the players who met those marks. So that's why we're going to talk about it here today. So first, let's start off with the wide receiver position. And of the position groups that I did, this one by far had the most draft prospects that hit the marks that the Green Bay Packers typically have, I think. And I'll put the article link below because I'm not going to name off every single player. I'll name off a couple. But I think there's 10, 12, maybe even 15 or so draft prospects at the receiver position who hit the usual marks that the Green Bay Packers look for. So of Brian Gutekunst's 9 draft picks as general manager of the Packers at the receiver position, 6 of them have had a relative athletic score of 8.4 out of 10 or higher. So as I went through the wide receivers who participated at the NFL Combine, 8.4 relative athletic score. That was the benchmark, right? That mark or higher continued on and made the list. In addition to that, we know that the Packers prefer bigger bodied wide receivers, right? 5'11", 190 pounds is typically what we see the Packers covet when it comes to the receiver position. As far as the athletic testing goes, receivers who ran a 7.1 second 3-cone or faster were also included. So those were the 3 marks that the receivers had to hit in order to make my short list of prospects to keep your eyes on. And a couple of names that did hit those benchmarks: Isaiah Nayor from Nebraska, Isaac Tesla from Arkansas, Sam Brown from Miami, Jaden Higgins from Iowa State. And again, there's about 10, 12, 15 or so draft prospects who hit the thresholds that we just mentioned. So check the article link out below to see who all those prospects are. All right, and before we jump to the defensive line, last thing I'll say about the wide receiver position, and I've talked about it here before, there doesn't seem to be the same high-end talent in this draft class at the receiver position that we've grown accustomed to. But again, by the number of prospects on the list that we have here that meet the typical thresholds that the Packers have, it does show that Brian Gutekunst might have options, right? When it comes to, I think more realistically, when they take a receiver in the second, third, fourth round range, if they're going to add to the room. And I've gone on the record here saying, I think finding that true number one target is going to be really difficult, right? There's just not a lot of those guys out there. And we mentioned in the draft that this year's class in terms of high-end top talent isn't what we've seen in recent years. However, where the Brian Gutekunst could view there being value in adding to the position is just the competition component. And one thing that really stood out for me from last year, a year ago, when Brian Gutekunst would speak with us, is how valuable he found the competition on the roster in 2023 and the pivotal role, the catalyst that was towards this Packers team making such a quick and big jump during that 2023 season. So now that we're coming off of a year in 2024 where the receivers dropped passes, wrong routes, didn't see the growth from that unit that we were hoping, you can see why Brian Gutekunst would say, all right, we got to infuse more talent in this room to really push these guys and to, as Brian Gutekunst said, after the season, to raise the urgency, not just for the receiver room, but he was referring to the roster as a whole. And so thinking from it through that lens, we can see why, again, even though there might not be that Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase receiver in this class, that there's still value for the Packers in trying to raise the level of their wide receiver room by just adding more talent to it. And again, from an athletic, from a measurement perspective, there should be options in this draft class for them. All right, now let's transition to the defensive line. When it comes to the defensive end position, Brian Gutekunst prefers the elite of the elite athletes. He's made 5 defensive end draft picks during his tenure as GM. 4 of them have scored 8.97 or higher on the relative athletic score scale. So for my line in the sand, made an even 9.0. In addition to that, at defensive end, we know that Brian Gutekunst values, again, bigger bodied defensive ends. 250, 255 pounds is kind of the minimum in terms of weight at that position. He wants that position group, obviously, to get after the quarterback, but have the ability to hold up against the run as well. Now, personally, I think there's value if the Packers were to maybe go off script a little bit, bring in a different play style, maybe if that means going under that typical weight threshold to get a lighter, faster, more speed pass rush presence. Again, just to vary up the style, the types of pass rushers that you have. But traditionally, again, 250, 255 pounds is what the Packers value at that position. Relative athletic score of 9 or higher. And again, we looked at how these players performed in the explosive drills. The vertical jump, the broad jump, what was their split? What was their 10-yard split in the 40-yard dash? Again, the ability for that burst element, obviously an important part of playing defensive end. And some of the names that met these marks were Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M, Landon Jackson from Arkansas, Tyler Barron from Miami, and Baron Sorrell from Texas. So again, a couple names at the defensive end position to keep our eyes on. When it comes to defensive tackle, very much a wide-ranging variance in terms of relative athletic scores who Brian Gutekunst has drafted. This position group is a difficult one just based on that metric to try to hone in on, all right, who might be on the Packers' radar. Of his 8 draft picks at defensive tackle, only 3 have scored 8.0 or higher on the relative athletic score scale. But we need to draw a line in the sand somewhere. 8.0 throughout the roster is kind of typically been the low end for many of Brian Gutekunst's draft picks. So that's what we used here for this exercise. And again, we use the explosive drills, vertical jump, broad jump, 10-yard split in the 40, who performed really well at the defensive tackle position in those metrics. And again, the weight standpoint. 290 was the, again, line in the sand that I used for the defensive tackle group, because I remember 2 years ago when Green Bay drafted Kobe Wooden, who I think was in the mid 270, high 270 range for his weight, and that was very much an outlier at that time in terms of who Brian Gutekunst has typically drafted when it comes to that defensive tackle position. So a couple names here to know who, again, hit these marks are Warren Brinson from Georgia, Darius Alexander from Toledo, TJ Sanders from South Carolina, and CJ West from Indiana. All right, now on to the cornerback position. Again, this is a position group where size, length, been really, really important to Brian Gutekunst. He even mentioned that at the NFL Combine. However, and I wrote about this recently when discussing the cornerback position, one comment that he made at the Combine that stood out to me in terms of how the Packers are evaluating this position. Again, size and length have always been important to them. I don't think that's going to change, but Brian Gutekunst did mention at the Combine the perhaps added emphasis this offseason on identifying what the player's vision is like, what their versatility, their awareness is at the cornerback position, because those specific skill sets, the vision, the awareness elements, are important aspects to being a successful cornerback in Jeff Hafley's defense. So those might be some traits. Again, those are skills you obviously always want your cornerbacks to have, but it sounds like there might be a greater emphasis from the Packers' perspective on trying to identify those traits in their evaluation process. So I did find that was interesting, something to just be mindful of as the rest of this draft process unfolds. But typically speaking, at the cornerback position, size, length, very, very important. 5'11", 185, 190 pounds. It's kind of the benchmark that we had in terms of identifying which cornerbacks could fit the Green Bay Packers and what they're looking for. The 3-cone drill, running it in 6.9 seconds or faster. Again, that change of direction ability, obviously important at the cornerback position. And 5 of Brian Gutekunst's 7 draft picks have scored 9.0 or higher on the RAS scale. So those were the metrics that I used to identify some cornerbacks to keep our eyes on. Darian Porter from Iowa State, Max Hairston from Kentucky, and Jahdae Barron from Texas. Those are all first, second round names if the Packers are going to address the cornerback position early on to keep our eyes on that fit what they're looking for. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about the offensive line position. And of the position groups we discussed here today and trying to hone in on which prospects fit who the Packers typically want at that position, again, measurement-wise, athletically speaking, this one was the most difficult because the agility drills, the 3-cone, the shuttle, are an important part of that evaluation process for the Packers, but very, very few of these offensive linemen at the NFL Combine ran these drills. So we didn't really have that metric to go off of, again, to try to whittle this list down even further. So all I used for the offensive line group was a RAS of 8.0 or higher because of Gutekunst's 11 draft picks along the offensive line. 8 of them have at least hit that mark. And the other variable in play here when it comes to the offensive line, just because a tackle maybe doesn't meet these measurements that the Packers typically covet at the position, doesn't mean that they won't end up as a Green Bay Packer, but playing guard instead. So I did not take that factor into account when trying to make this list. So again, when it comes to the offensive line play, RAS of 8.0 or higher is what we used to determine who are some of the prospects that we should be keeping our eyes on. At offensive tackle, Jalen Travis from Iowa State, Logan Brown from Kansas, 2 names to know. And then along the interior offensive line. Again, there were more than just these 2, but Tate Ratledge from Georgia, Jared Wilson from Georgia. And we all know how the Packers have an affinity for drafting Georgia players, so a couple players along the offensive line to watch for. So there you have it, my friends. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you found this helpful. And again, the players that I mentioned are just a few at each position group. There are more. The article link is below where you can find all of the prospects who hit the specific benchmarks that we talked about. But as always, I appreciate you tuning in. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 1055 ESPN Lacrosse app. Till next time, friends, take care.